Are you sure?
Here's the 30-second lesson on what legends know. Never ask a bride why she's getting married. Don't wear a skirt on a windy day. Deodorant is not a shower. Don't sniff chili flakes. And don't forget, saving is not investing. Legends don't just save, they invest in mutual funds. Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
I'm taking the liberty of picking up just one aspect, or what might look like a marginal aspect, or you might even think that I'm flying off on a tangent, or a case of जाते थे जापान पहुंच गए चीन. However, this to me is a very fascinating aspect from whatever Donald Trump said and did since his swearing in or his inauguration. Among the hundreds of things that he's done, threatened, promised to do, and when I say hundreds, I'm not exaggerating, because he has in any case rescinded nearly 80 orders of the outgoing Biden administration, then issued a whole bunch of executive orders, and you can see him signing with full sound effects. His pen also makes sizable sound as it runs. He has a long signature and uses a big felt pen. That said, if you look at all of those, maybe dozens of those need analysis, and those will be analyzed in times to come. Those are already being talked about by big Gyanis much bigger than me. So I don't think I can add right now very much more to that, except say a couple of things. One, that Trump has now indicated, first of all, he's indicated that this is the new Republican Party, which means that everything that you know knew the Republican Party for does not apply. The use by date on that is over. This is a Trumpian party. This is not the Republican Party with the general Republican values, which also get quote-unquote compromised for the sake of governing. He is not following any of those norms. That's one. The second thing that he has indicated is that for him, he may not enforce sanctions, but for him, tariffs will be the new sanctions. So he will threaten countries that he disagrees with, or countries that offend him, or countries that he thinks are working in a way that is adverse to American interests. He will use tariffs against them. So tariffs are the new sanctions. And third, the most intriguing and most interesting, he said he doesn't believe in war. He will not take America to war. If anything, he will end all wars. At the same time, why he said that, he declared that America was at war. What does it mean? Because he invoked a wartime law, the 1798 Alien Enemies Act, which he said he will invoke now to get rid of not just illegal immigrants or quote-unquote illegal immigrants from America, but also the cartels, the gangs, the mafias, etc., who may be rooted overseas but who have now become very deeply entrenched in America and are destroying America's cities, particularly America's inner cities. So that's a declaration of war, because you know what? This law, the Alien Enemies Act of 1798, it's an 18th century law. This law was enacted during a war, and this law was also enacted to deal with the wartime situation. Has rarely been used since then. It was used then because there was a war on, and I will tell you about that war. That's the reason I got so fascinated about this. It was then used in 1812 against the war with sort of the same related combatants. I will come to that. In 1812, it's just called the War of 1812. If you Google the War of 1812, you will find it. And then in the First World War, not that much, but Second World War in a big way. Second World War, it was used against German and Italians living in America because America was fighting a war against them. At the same time, you might remember that nearly 100,000 Japanese were also interned. 100,000 people of Japanese origin, most of them from the island of Hawaii. They had been interned, but this law was not used to intern them because a bulk of them, I think about 70 to 75,000, if I read American accounts, of those Japanese were actually American citizens, because by this time they had become naturalized or they had been born in America and they had become citizens by birthright. That is again a right that Trump has now threatened to take away with his executive orders. That said, the fascinating thing is the 1798 law. So what was the war that was going on in 1798? 1798 is just when George Washington has finished his presidency and John Adams has taken over. So this is still the Washingtonian era. George Washington in 1794 decreed that US ships, merchant ships will carry no arms, because the general view was that shipping was safe, that also the British were there, the British controlled the seas, and there was no real problem, right? However, problem had started arising earlier, and that problem was between the Americans and the French. So a war had started between the Americans and the French. So when you ask people now, I was also thrown, oh, Americans and the French fought a war. Now it looks like the French were really keenly involved and closely involved in whatever was happening in America in that period, say from the mid 18th century to early 19th century, say from 1750s onwards to 1810s. The French were involved in one way or the other. Now this war took place because in 1789 the French Revolution starts. Bastille Day, you remember? 1789 July, the French Revolution starts. The first French Republic comes up, and the first French Republic then comes to the Americans and says, listen, you owe us money. You haven't paid us back our money. At the same time, you're also bound by a treaty. This is the Treaty of Alliance of 1778. You have to Google all this. All this is fascinating stuff, and that's the reason I've got distracted and actually gone off on this tangent, because this is such interesting stuff. Anything that happens today, I keep saying, started a long time back. But in this case, what's happening today started in the 18th century. So in fact, what has come up now started 227 years ago. Now, what was this law? The French said that you signed a treaty with us. The treaty was called the Treaty of Alliance, 1778. Under that treaty, the Americans and the French were to come to each other's defense. Now, that treaty, the Americans thought had lapsed. That treaty did not have a use-by date, but the treaty ran for some time. That French-American association had started, or French involvement in America had started in 1754. Between 1754 and 1763, the British colonies in America went to war against the French colonies in America. And each one had a bunch of native Indian tribes fighting alongside them. This was a brutal war. As you can see, this went on for almost 10 years, 9 years at least. During this, the French acquired a foothold, and a lot of new citizens also came from France. The new citizens who came from France, this is complicated, so stay with me and fasten seat belts. The new citizens who came from France, like many other new citizens, they were supporters of the new Democratic Republican Party. There was also such an entity because the ruling power in the US around time this French-American war took place were the Federalists. So Federalists, their opposition were the Democrat Republicans. The new citizens tended to support the Democrat Republicans. Now in the 1754, 1763 British colonies versus French colonies wars, the French came in, and then the Americans and the French signed this treaty, the Treaty of Coalition of 1778. Now, as the French Revolution took place, also warfare started between the French and the British. For a lot of the 18th century and some part of the 19th century, the Brits and the French were fighting each other all the time. That is until the end of Napoleon, right? At that point, the French thought they had territories in the Americas, what is called as the French West Indies. Those are still there. And they thought that the Americans were treaty bound to help them in their war against the British, because the British had a very strong navy and they were impeding French shipping. Now the Americans were in no position to help because the Americans did not have a navy at that point, nor did they think that that treaty of 1778 also put an obligation on them to protect the French from the British. So they did not come to help the French, and the French started some kind of a war. I'm saying some kind of a war because if you look at the history, even if you Google, Just Google the quasi-war. This was a quasi-war that started in 1798. So the French would send some vessels. They started harassing American vessels, American merchant vessels, because American merchant vessels were not armed. I told you in 1994, George Washington said they will not be armed. America did not have a navy at that point. So the French then, also the French privateers. Privateers are people who might have a boat, but they are authorized by a government or by a sovereign to conduct operations on their behalf and do all the looting and collecting their booty and selling it in war price market. So you capture a ship, you capture its cargo, you can auction it. These French privateers also started to harass and hijack American ships. Within the first year of this operation, the number of seized American ships by the French, whether by the French Navy or by the French privateers, had already added up to 316. 1798 to 1799, 1800, when this quasi-war was going on between the Americans and the French. The French and the British power and also the Dutch, they were involved wherever they used to fight wars those days. That was mostly on the seas. They were involved in the war called the War of the First Coalition, that is 1792-97. So this quasi-war was simultaneous to that war, and the Americans sort of found themselves a little bit isolated in that situation because the British were preoccupied. By 1800, however, the Royal Navy came in to help the Americans. The American Navy had also got moving. In fact, one of America's old and very large merchant vessels had been converted into a warship with 26 guns. Those days warships had cannons, 26 guns. It was called USS Ganges. Why was it called USS Ganges? Because that was an ocean-going merchant vessel that made frequent trips also to Kolkata and Canton. American government's paranoia about the French, one was because of the war, and second, because of the fear that a lot of the new citizens who were of French origin, they had enthusiasm about the French Revolution, and that's how their loyalties could be suspect. This is also a time when ship owners in New England, in America, they became very rich because they were running the British blockade, doing illegal stuff with shipping and making money. At the same time, those in the south of America, they were afraid that the French, after the revolution, had abolished slavery in 1794. And that quote-unquote bad idea will now flow from France into America. So they wanted to stop those influences also. That's why these laws were enacted. Now, US had multiple problems. One, they did not have a navy as yet. The navy came up in 1798. In fact, George Washington had started the process in his time, and in 1798, formally, the US Navy was founded. But at this point, the US did not have an existing navy, plus they did not have the money to immediately start building one because they had spent too much money. They had finished all their resources in the Revolutionary War before that. So they were also punch drunk. They were recovering from a very long and very difficult and very withering war. That was the situation in which the French were giving them trouble. For clearer perspective, we have to remember three more things. One, the French helped the Americans in the Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War ended. In 1793, the French wanted the money back and the Americans refused to pay. Because in that period, a couple of other complexities had come into being. In 1783, the American Revolutionary War ended with the Treaty of Paris. Following up on the Treaty of Paris, in 1794, the Americans and the British, Washington's Americans and the British in this case, signed something called the Jay Treaty, which generally meant freedom of navigation in relevant seas and no conflict between them. It is as a consequence of this that George Washington officially declared a policy of neutrality as the war of coalition took place between the French and their partners and the British and their partners. And the American government now, at this point, the Federalist government, they got paranoid that the new citizens there, particularly those of the French origin, they might be more sympathetic to the French. And that's why they came up with a whole set of laws. That is, set of 4 laws. What are these laws? One is Naturalization Act. Under this law, the period that a new arrival needed to get naturalized as a citizen of America was raised from 5 years to 14 years. Second was an Alien Friend Act, Alien Friends Act. Third was an Alien Enemies Act. Fourth was the Sedition Act. So barring the third, Alien Enemies Act, all other laws then lapsed over time. Most lapsed by the end of 1800, 1801. That's when the war ended. Napoleon rose in France then 1804. By 1800, the French consulate, as it's called, that had come into being. So the post-revolution instability had settled down. And by that time, there was peace and war had ended. So a couple of the laws were repealed by the Congress then. And the third one was repealed later. In fact, it was the public protest against these laws that led to the Federalists losing the election of 1800 and Democrat Republicans coming into power. That is the politics of that period. Now, what were these laws? Naturalization Act, I told you, the naturalization period from 5 years became 14 years. So newcomers would not suddenly become citizens. Second was Alien Friends Act. Under this law, the US president had the power to arrest, to detain and deport non-citizens if they made a conclusion that they were doing something wrong or something harmful to American interests. Sedition Act was the most interesting. Sedition Act was basically a censorship act. It said nobody is allowed to print, utter or publish any false, scandalous and malicious writing against the government. Now, one reason this act was enacted was that the media or the newspapers at that time were mostly controlled by Democratic Republicans or by new citizens. That's why only journalists prosecuted under this law were from those newspapers and organizations. This was accompanied by the Senate also acquiring contempt power to act against journalists. This led to a big outcry in America of that period and to the defeat of Federalists in that election. So 3 of these laws, as I told you, lapsed. One has remained on the American statute, that is the Alien Enemies Act. Now, under Alien Enemies Act, US government can detain and deport non-citizens. In fact, the power is more to detain. Deportation is then a finding that has to be made. But this law has then been subsequently used. I told you this was used in 1812. That said, we now shift to World War II. In World War II, about 31,000 people of German and Italian origin were detained under this law in America. Now, many countries had these laws. We, for example, in India, Pakistan, we inherited from the British something called the Enemy Properties Act. That's the law that the British had enacted during the World War. That is to possess the property and assets to citizens of your enemy country. For example, if Germans had any assets in India then, or the Italians or the Japanese had any assets in India then, India and Pakistan have kept that law in their books, in their respective books, and this is now used quite often to try and target the properties of, say, the Muslim families who might have left India partly with some members staying in India, and similarly to repossess by the government of Pakistan the properties that the Hindus have left behind there. That is where that Enemy Properties Act is used. So wartime laws are troublesome. This wartime law was used in the Second World War. Wartime laws are also rarely used because most countries now don't go to wars to that extent. In the Second World War, as I had mentioned to you earlier, because that's a story that comes up often, the internment of the Japanese by the Americans. As I mentioned earlier, 70,000 of these 100,000 Japanese were actually American citizens. So their internment and their detention was not carried out using the Alien Enemies Act. That was carried out through an executive order by FDR, President FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Now, the Japanese immigration in America also has a complexity. The Japanese who came originally, who were not born in America, they are called Issei, they were foreign born. And their children then, who were born in America, are called Nisei. So Nisei became natural American citizens by birth. That's why these laws could not be applied to them, because they were American citizens already. They were interned, they were taken to these internship camps. They were also at some point given the opportunity or the choice of fighting in the US forces. 30,000 of them did so, including Daniel Inouye, who later rose to be a very respected senator from Hawaii. He fought He fought with the American army in the Second World War, lost his right arm on one of the Pacific Islands. And I do remember watching him during the Iran-Contra hearings. Because he was the one raising the toughest questions of Oliver North and others. And somebody insinuated that because he had Japanese ancestry, maybe he wasn't so loyal. And he did point out that, look, I fought for this country and I left my right arm on a Pacific island fighting with my squad. That is how complicated immigration tends to be. And that is how messy any reversal of immigration and naturalization is going to be. And it is this law that Trump now says he's going to lose. Now, it might be an interesting idea because it'll fire up his base, but there is a complexity in the law. The law says it can be invoked if there is, and I quote, any invasion or predatory incursion perpetrated, attempted, or threatened against the territory of the US by any foreign nation or government. Now, if you read all the experts who've been talking, migrants, whether legal, illegal, or acting on their own, they are not foreign governments or foreign nations. So how do you use this? Can you use this against foreign gangs and cartels? Can you say that their activity amounts to invasion by a foreign country? Maybe yes, maybe not, but it looks tough. However, you can say that such and such country has been taken over by mafia, so the country is a mafia state. Think Haiti, for example. Haiti is a country which cannot even have a police force. Sometimes Kenyans go and work there, I think a couple of times. India has also sent peacekeeping police forces, CRPF, etc., to work there because Haiti is run by gangs and gang lords. They cannot even have a police force. And Haiti has been in Trump's crosshairs in this campaign. So we don't know how this will work. We don't know how his use of this law will pass the test of the American law and constitution. But this is something he invoked, and I thought this was really interesting. That said, in conclusion, there is one more interesting sidelight. That is the renaming of Mount Denali in Alaska as Mount McKinley. Now, Mount Denali was renamed. It was Mount McKinley to begin with. It was renamed Mount Denali in 2015, obviously then by a Democratic president, in deference to the local people's, native people's wishes. For the native Koyukon people, in their language, Koyukon language, Denali means tall. This is also something that both senators, Republican senators from Alaska support, again out of respect for the native people. He's renaming it back after President McKinley. McKinley was the Republican president of America between 1897 and 1901. He seemed to be somebody who brought in a lot of growth and this Republican kind of economics as we've gotten to know now. In fact, Trump goes on to say that it's because of the riches that he had created that later America could deal with more economic hardship. So maybe he's using McKinley also as a kind of metaphor, or maybe to personify his own idea of restoring America's power, in his case by using the tariff. So there's a lot more to play out on this story, because watch all those executive orders, watch all the rest that will come up. But more importantly, more than what he's saying, watch his actions. We are in for very exciting times, both in geopolitics and international trade. In fact, now increasingly, those two are going to be completely intertwined with each other.